So good afternoon, everyone. A warm welcome to Creature Research Series, co-convened with the Center for Contemporary Chinese Art and the Transcultural Exchanges and Network Research Strand of Creature. Multicultural Art Institutions at the Crossroads is a two-part series of panel discussion with art and cultural policymakers, art practitioners and professionals, and academic researchers seeking to unpack the challenges and expectations faced by multicultural art organizations. Today's panel discussion, Institutional Art Archives, is one part of the set to articulate the role and challenges of institutional archive as an active agency for memory that expresses and sustains the multicultural heritage through contemporary visual art. I am Wesley Lane, Professor of Transcultural Arts and Design and the Director of Creature. I will be moderating the panel discussion. Before I introduce you our speakers, I would like to remind you that this session is recorded. We appreciate the audience to switch off the camera and microphone so that we can focus on the whole panel on the screen. Unfortunately, the chat box cannot display questions or comments, so we appreciate the audience to raise their hands to speak in the question time towards the end of the session. Today, we are delighted to welcome 5 guests from London to Manchester to as far as Hong Kong to discuss institutional art archives. Our speakers are Warren Leung Chiwo, artist, associate professor in the School of Creative Media at the City University of Hong Kong and co-founder of Hong Kong-based Parasite, one of the oldest and most active independent art institutions in Asia. John Tan, Head of Research at Asia Art Archive, an independent non-profit that documents the multiple histories of art in Asia. Dr. Alda Teresiano, co-leader of the Center for Critical Heritage Studies at UCL and founding chair of Future Histories Archives, which documents British-based Black performance and carnival. Mariana Sionki, senior curator of the Contemporary Chinese Art Center, a contemporary art gallery based in Manchester, aims to advance the education of the public in contemporary Chinese arts and culture. And Katie Warren, archivist at Cfcca, manages the archive and library at the center. Welcome you all, and thank you for taking part in our panel discussion. Now, without further ado, let's start our discussion. I'd like to begin by asking each speaker to tell us more about your affiliated archive. What does it do and what does it stand for? What does it represent? So I'll start with John.
Let's see. So let's see. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. So I'm John Tan. I'm head of research at Asia Art Archive. And for those of you who are not familiar with AAA, as we like to refer to ourselves, we are an organization that was founded in 2000 to basically support and encourage the research in contemporary art of Asia. And I guess what we stand for is a kind of more generous art history about inclusion and diversity. So maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. Alda, you want to follow on?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Yes, I today I'm going to focus especially on future histories. Also, as you said, my remit in terms of research has kind of widened up to include culturally diverse communities, mainly in the UK, but also internationally. And future histories, it's actually turning 20 this year. We set up the organization in 2001. It was a collaboration between myself and the Black Theatre Forum, an organization that was active at the time. Yeah, I will talk more about future histories, but we basically focus in terms of collection policy on the preservation and dissemination of African and Asian heritage in the UK. So yeah, and as you said, mainly focused on theatre and arts. Thank you.
Thank you, Ada. Warren?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. And Parasite was founded in 1996 as an artist collective and an artist-run space. And having no idea about archiving anything from the beginning, we actually had idea to keep things going and kind of like in our own memories. And we had a very strong idea to document everything because we thought that like after some time nobody would remember what had happened. And so things have been kept in different members' homes, and most of them would be in the office. But from time to time things got lost and crashed and so on. And personally, officially, I had been involved in Parasite until 2007. And I guess like from time to time, people asked what had happened before. So very good that like the current team of Parasite had this idea to really make an archive as much as possible of everything which had happened at Parasite and related. And so this year they had this project to archive all these documents from the office, basically publications and press release and all these basically official documents. And they also had like make interviews with people involved in the early years of Parasite. And now I suppose all this information has been launched online and available to people and who's interested in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren. Mariana, you want to tell us a little bit more about the archive at CFCCA?
Yeah, I can. First of all, thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Wes, for organizing this talk. Perhaps I should say a little bit about the organization, and Katie is more suitable to talk about the archive. CFCCA was founded in 1986 as a Chinese Art Center back then. It was a grassroots organization working very closely with the Manchester-based Chinese community. And it slowly evolved into an art center and an international gallery through various shifts and rebranding of the organization. Katie, would you like to say something about the archives?
Yeah, so the archive itself is it's mostly the corporate records of the organisation. So this is the documentation of our activities since 1986, and the archive itself was established in 2016 as a result of the centre celebrating its 30th anniversary. And I was brought in as a project archivist initially in a project funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And part of that project was to bring meaningful access to our library and archive collections. And as a result of that, we were able to document our early materials and make them accessible online. And now, since then, I've been working through most of our other material to make it more accessible for both researchers and the organisation. So it's still very early days in terms of what we're working towards, but slowly we're working through our material to make it accessible to people.
Right.
Perhaps I should also say that my involvement with the archive was when I joined the organization as a research curator. I worked really closely with Katie. I was the project manager of the archive and library project, and we worked closely with Katie. Katie was responsible for organizing and for the archive-related activities. I was more responsible for the public program elements of this project.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And I can spot that there is an element of sort of institutionalizations in the idea of the archive, particularly with CFCCA and also Parasite, because both the organizations are sort of grassroots based and also initiated by artists to begin with. So as our discussion today on institutional art archive, I want to problematize the term of institutional. So what does it mean by sort of institutional art archive? What exactly it is, and what's that difference from others like cultural archive or social archive? And at which point did this archive become an institution? And I know Katie may be able to also give us a bit of insight of these various categorization. Can I begin with Katie?
Yeah, so strictly speaking, sort of the term archive is a term that's used for two different things. So there is what we would refer as an archive collection, which is a collection of material that usually comes from a single source. That can be either, it could be an organisation, a person, a group. So it's usually something it all comes from the same source, and it's not always collected for a purpose. It's sometimes created over time as part of that organisation's activities. The other term for an archive is to refer to an institution that holds archive collections. So in sense of what we have at the centre is we hold the records of the centre, and these are the sort of our corporate records which document our activities since 1986, and this includes the records that any businesses create, as well as material about our programme and our artistic work. And the records that we have particularly were created organically, so it wasn't actually collected, it's just what we've organically produced over a period of our history, course of the business of the centre. So in terms of an institutional archive is usually would be that sort of created by an organisation or a group over time, though there are other institutional archives which are actively collecting materials as well as maintaining the records that they produce themselves.
Right. Okay. And Alda, I know that, I mean, you are you're the sort of one-man band to begin with, initiating an archive for Black performance and theatre, and is a huge work. And certainly at the beginning, it wasn't an institution to begin with. So I wonder, what is your experience, and how, and at which point that is somehow your archive turned into this sort of institution?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's actually really interesting, this kind of dichotomy you are creating, because in a sense, for an organization like Future Histories, it's slightly artificial, right? When we think of the archive of Tate Gallery, for example, right, and that is an art archive, and that's certainly in itself already an institution. We clearly know that the issue of representation will be obviously an issue in terms of, is that museum representing, you know, certain artists, and therefore we can enter in the debate of representation, etc. But when you have archives like Future Histories, that is also like, for example, the V&A archive, actively collecting material, but within a specific remit. In our case, it's African and Asian diaspora in the performing arts in the UK, and we focused obviously on London. Then what happens is that the resistance to become institutionalized, as in the case of Future Histories, and retain a level of independence, was very much to respond to the need of the community. So on the one hand, we end up behaving, if you like, in terms of policy documents, in terms of acquisitions of resources, etc., as an institutional archive. But in actual facts, what we have been, you know, wanting to retain from the very beginning was that level of independence that allowed us to be close to the community, and to, in this proximity to the community, then to create a number of strategies that would allow a kind of porous contamination, if you like, between the two structures, So what you had, for example, was the possibility of problematizing practices around cataloging, which would happen in a certain way in the institutional art archive, and we basically just turned them upside down because we actually looked at where is the expertise. Now, in an institutional art archive, the expertise would be exclusively seen within those who have been trained within the profession. And obviously, I had maximum respect for Katie and, Katie's professionalism, or, anyone obviously who's trained in the profession. And I'm based at UCL, which is, the home for training, professionals in the sector. But at Future Histories, we also saw the artists as, experts. We also saw the members of the communities as experts when it came to providing the information on how to organize the material, how to catalog the material, what kind of language was, should have been used, and what kind of outreach activities should have been designed. So in a sense, we kind of happily embraced hybridity in our practice. And obviously I can talk more about it later. But yeah, this is how I probably would problematize, if you like, a little bit.
Oh, yeah, but that point very interesting. I mean, well, you're quite hybridity. I would say like more co-creation, where you're working with the community and almost like designing which material is going to go into the archive. So yeah, you're right in a way that this is very much like problematize the idea of institutions. So you take on a very different approach when you are taking up your archive. And I wonder whether that's something unfold in your case, Warren, for Parasite, because certainly when Parasite was found, and it is never really his aim to become an archive, or well, at least part of the activities is archiving. So how did it come to that point, and how did it now become an institution related to his archive?
Yeah, I think like we actually didn't really have concrete ideas about archive, but as I said, indeed, like when I looked at our seniors, like in the 80s, and it seems that like not so much information has really like left after they ceased organizing their activities. Indeed, like a lot of people left Hong Kong as well. But what I would say that I was a student, so I had a lot of kind of like deep, strong memories of their activities. But you just have found no way to really trace what they have done. So when we were studying Parasite, already we thought that like it would be important to keep like pieces of memories at certain points. That's why we had actually very strong motivation to do documentation of our exhibitions and projects as well. And also like for personal interests of some members, we were actually very interested in making books and catalogs and so on. And it's important because we knew from the beginning, like all these activities, exhibitions, which only last for a few weeks or at most a month, but it's the documentation and publication which could last like, I don't know for how long, but much longer than the exhibition itself. And also, we consider the discussion and the debate of all these activities we have done could actually continue if we could really maintain all this information and catalog and publications. So it was really crazy work. We did all these volunteers to publish. And I can still remember like in the first years, we could do like 10 catalogs a year, and mostly done by volunteers. And of course, they were not really fake books, but like a lot of work actually has been made for those. And you just accumulate a lot of this information. And actually when the current Parasite, they had this idea to do this project. And now to look back, I find it's interesting because it seems that we did not really think to create this archive, but we tried hard to keep all this information. It seems that like one day someone would do this with all this information. And then like after 20 years that happens. And so it's interesting to do, to look at, the current archive, because still, I think an archive is this home of information that allow people to make their own interpretations. And for me, I find it's interesting because all the time you could see that like people would have very much different memories of all these activities. So the information now in the archive would somehow provide certain kind of, I wouldn't say evidence, but like pieces of, information that allow people to stitch them back. And so it would be interesting to see different stories, and actually when people with different positions and roles can according their own interests to create their own stories and narratives of all these activities. And I think also Parasite, we actually have certain ideas about our communities, although like we were not like everything, but still like we had our friendship, we had our affiliates, and people who worked with us. So I think somehow like when you look at Parasite, indeed you could really see already there were like different generations in it. And the interesting point exactly, now when I no longer involved in running Parasite, and I could really see how Parasite would end up as a different organization, institution in different people's agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I want to, sort of dig in a little bit more as well, because certainly you are co-founder of Parasite, but now you're also the subject of materials for archiving. So how do you sort of see these activities going to the lives of artists and community?
Well, I suppose with the archive, you actually can at the same time see there's a contest between the memories and so-called the history, or true for different people's interpretations. And it's not important to get one authentic history. I guess it's more interesting to deliver like different versions of narratives, and because you cannot have only one version of history, and the multi perspectives of like the activities would be even more helpful and useful for people to understand what had happened. And because we all stood in different positions in the beginning, like we were artists, but at the same time we found its need to do writing and curating, and we were not trained for that, but we just found it's the opportunities to exercise, this kind of experiments. And now to look back, and I think it's actually part of like everybody's memory. Although like they might remember I was an artist, or they might remember I was the founder or activity organizer, but it's somehow like you can really see stories from different positions, as I said, that you can actually find sort of like social history of the communities in Hong Kong back in the 1990s for that.
Sure, yeah. And I wonder whether, I don't know whether John is here. Hi, John, are you there? Just trying to find him now. Okay.
I'm here.
Hi. Yes, just want to check whether you would like to respond to that in terms of the archive turning into an institution. And obviously, in your case, it's very different because AAA, to begin with, is already an institution. So, to what extent that it stands for, I mean, what does it represent, and to whom does it really represent it? Can you tell us a little bit more about, in your context, how does it work?
Perhaps I can add one point before John, because
sure.
like, as I said, that we were not like making an archive in those early years, but we did sense that somehow an urgency as we saw like things kind of like being lost gradually, or people started to forget something, and I lost my memory as well. At one point, actually, we thought that maybe we should just like give all this information to Asia Art Archive.
Yeah, that's also an interesting point, because I mean, certainly Parasite decided to have its own sort of archive, but you could have as well give it all to AAA, because AAA have more robust system kind of cataloging, and also, well, it's sort of bigger organization to represent artists. So that's also a very interesting point that you've set it up for Parasite, whereas like what rather than give it all to AAA. John.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think that, interesting points were raised by both Warren and by Alda about the question of artists and archives. In the case of Asia Art Archive, as the name suggests, we are an organization that exists for the purpose of archiving art of Asia, hence the name. But when we started, we had a very different modus operandi than the one that we have now. So that is to say, when we began in 2000, the organization really did start very simply as a kind of a library for contemporary art of Asia. And so, literally began with a shelf of books. And from there, it grew as people who were part of the organization devoted their time to documenting the art of Asia as it was happening. So in other words, there were researchers who would go and attend events, who would go visit galleries to see exhibitions, and who would basically be collecting information, photographing exhibitions, collecting press clippings, and so in some ways becoming a kind of a repository, live repository of things, live documenting or live blogging, let's say, in some ways before blogs existed. About halfway into the organization's existence, so about 10 years ago, a little more than that, we switched into a mode where I think it became less about AAA itself documenting or archiving the present as it was happening. And partly I think it was because the organization realized, in fact, that there were artists and organizations who were self-documenting, who were creating their own archives, but who didn't necessarily have the means to make their archives available to a wider audience or a public. And so at that point, what AA did was it did start to work with individual artists and also with organizations and some art spaces. So, I think what Warren suggested is not entirely beyond the realm of the possible. In the sense that, what we did was work with those individuals and organizations to make their archives available to researchers and artists and others. And so that meant taking the physical materials and digitizing it, and then putting that on AA's website. And in most cases, returning the physical materials to their source. So AA, in other words, for the most part, does not collect the physical materials. Partly this is practical because Hong Kong space is at a premium, and so we have limited amount of space. But partly this is also for philosophical reasons, because we don't wish to expatriate materials that maybe would be best left in the region or country of origin. And so for those reasons, that kind of explains part of how we work. So the question of institutional archive is an interesting one for us, because obviously we're an institution and we have an archive, but our institutional archive is actually something which most people never see. And what you see is the archive that is the work itself. Parasite, the work itself is maybe the exhibition, Cfcca as well. In our case, the work itself is the building of the archive. And then there's a separate institutional archive that is completely another question in our case.
That's very interesting. And that comes to my questions about, you're talking about the various different things that you collected at AA. I suppose, well, that also relates to others as well. It's about the questions of collecting, what to collect and what not to collect. And how does this practice unfold, and what is the sort of power relationship related to presenting and representing? John.
Okay, well, so on the question of what to collect, what not to collect, and the relationship of everything. I mean, I think, you know, when AA started as an organization, its goal was to document contemporary art of Asia. I mean, that seems like an impossible goal nowadays, but I think if we think back to 20 years before, at that point in time, I think contemporary art as a field itself was maybe a smaller field, and it maybe was not as impossible a kind of an aim as it may seem today. I think there's such a kind of a fever pitch of activity across all of the world that it would be impossible for any one organization to really document everything, right? But I think that as the years progressed, it became clear that AA as an organization would have to be more and more selective if it was going to pursue that route of documenting and archiving in and of itself. Since that was impossible, and I think since there was, as I mentioned, the realization that there were individuals and organizations that were themselves already engaged in the act of documenting and preserving their own practices, the practices of their networks and their communities, I think it made more sense for us to switch to that. As to how we go about selecting and choosing who and what we work on and work with, I think that has to do with the basic kind of identity of AA, which is really to kind of encourage generosity in approach and in terms of giving access to artists and organizations that may have been overlooked. So in that sense, and also that was at threat of disappearing. So some of the earliest collections that we worked on that were not generated by AA itself were of artists in China, for instance, who had no institutional or let's say governmental organization who was going to document or collect their materials, and so that was kind of one way of thinking about who we work with. So this would include the avant-garde artists of China from the 1980s, but it also included collections such as the video collection of an artist named Ray Langenbach, who, in addition to being an artist, was also a videographer for many other artists. He was based in Malaysia, and he worked greatly with artists in Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand. And so his video collection actually documented the development of performance art in the region in the 1990s. And so, for instance, he is one of the few people to have had documentation of Brother Cane, which is a very important kind of formative performance that took place in Singapore. And literally what happened was this was a collection, because he also happened to document street protests and demonstrations, it was something that became a target possibly for censorship or even destruction. And so, he was looking for some organization to help him preserve that so that it would not disappear. And so that became one collection that we took on and we digitized, and to the extent possible made available on our website. It also includes other individuals such as Li Wen, who of course is an artist who was contemporaneous with what Ray Langenbach was doing, whose archive really had no home within Singapore, where the artist had been based. And so AA took on the work of documenting and archiving that and making it available. I mean, I guess I shouldn't say it's archiving, because the archive was there. It was more a question of making it, organizing it, and also digitizing it so that we could put it online and sharing it, because that in itself is a large amount of work that most individual artists just don't have the time to do. So this is what AA can contribute, is that labor and that work of helping to generate the kind of the online platform.
Sure. I can see, thank you, John, and I can see Alda wants to respond to that. Can I have Alda as well with your contribution on your archive? I suppose that you also take on a very specific role in documenting Black theatres. So that's also an aspect of what's your selection process, and what's the practice of collecting and the representation versus presentation.
Yeah, no, I completely follow, John's point in relation to facing the risk of disappearance of the material, because this is really how future history started. When at the time we're talking of early 90s, I was actually researching for my PhD on the history of Black theatre in the UK. And I was faced by huge difficulties in accessing primary resources. There was very little, if actually nothing, published academically on Black theatre on the British soil. And the only archival resources I could find were at the Theatre Museum. But the majority of the resources held at the Theatre Museum, which was part of the V&A, were actually not accessible because they had not been catalogued. So the question of, how these histories and stories can be made, accessible to users became actually from the very beginning something really important, and actually, was a limitation for researchers and the public in general were not accessing and not engaging with the whole area, the whole field, because of this, lack of primary resources. So what happened at the time was then I started engaging directly with the artists, and I started visiting their own homes and the company's offices. And there, again, John talks about the generosity, and I'm overwhelmed by, the openness and the generosity of these artists sharing their material, while aware of the incredible risk of actually losing all that history. And so, in a sense, when I met the members of the Black Theatre Forum, it was at the time when the forum was actually had lost funding from the Art Council. So, vulnerability that we need to acknowledge when we work on archives produced by artists, they actually lose that funding. What the premises where that material is held, what happens, to the possibility of preservation. So the archive at the time had been, the Black Theatre Forum archive had been distributed amongst a number of different locations, 5-6 locations, and various peoples and supporters were actually helping out housing the archive. And so this is how we started. I started by sitting down with the members of the board and looking at ways of actually developing a project that could help with preserving that original material. And we're talking of really the first organization in the UK that was effectively making an attempt to mainstreaming Black theatre and taking Black theatre to the West End, and so not just performing Black theatre in fringe venues. So from that, then we kind of realized that in some ways we had to institutionalize ourselves. So, we had to have some level of, organization. So we created an organization that would actually actively seek to collect and preserve this material. And that's how we then started defining, as a board of directors, defining the policies and defining, what would be our priorities. And so, in a sense, our priority became working with organizations, arts and theater organizations, that were at risk of losing the material. So because of funding, or also, for other reasons. So we then decided to work with the Nitro Theatre Company, which at the time was the Transformation of Black Theatre Cooperative, the oldest existing Black theatre company in the UK. We got in touch with Moti Roti, who soon after also lost the funding and had to close down. So we managed, obviously, the collection you know, before. And then Talawa Theatre Company, which at the time of, you know, when we started working with Talawa, was a transition point, and that was a very vulnerable moment in the history of the company. So in a sense, our driving force in collecting has been very much also a rush against time, to make sure that these invaluable resources would not be lost, that these invaluable resources would be made accessible. And not only that, but also how to function in a sense as, you know, kind of lobbying for the sector, pushing the sector, pushing the institutions to actually recognize this need and making the most of their resources. So at some point we developed a quite big project for a small organization like Future Histories called Trading Faces Recollecting Slavery. And we worked in collaboration with the National Archives and the V&A to basically finally catalog all those resources which were at the, you know, V&A and had not been cataloged up to that point. So we're talking of Pemba Theatre Company, Black Mime. These are iconic organizations, arts organizations that still were not available to anyone, basically, because had not been organized, had not been cataloged, and therefore could not be made fully accessible to users. And by working in collaboration, again, you talked before about co-creation, collaboration, these have been our, you know, keywords and key points of action. We raised the funds for a catalog to be employed. So yeah, I guess, yeah, that's how we've been working. I don't know if I respond to your...
Yeah, yeah, indeed. I think, well, there is aspects about, like, I mean, you're talking about the way, like, how you feel like the archive needs to be an institution in order to push the artists to the mainstream and help them to unlock different kinds of opportunities. And that echoes quite a lot with what Cfcca does, in a way that you didn't begin with an archive, but actually it's an organization that promotes contemporary Chinese art. But subsequently you found that there's also aspects of work which is necessary to collect and make knowledge available to the public. And I wonder whether Mariana wants to speak a little bit about that. How do you, in the Cfcca case, how does this sort of collecting and sort of collecting and not collecting practices take place? I mean, what's the decision behind, and what are the power dynamics of presenting and representing? Mariana, are you here?
Sorry, I was muted. I'm sorry.
Okay. No problem.
I think that would it be useful, I think in a way Katie make this distinction at the beginning, but I think that what is important to clarify is that the difference, in my understanding, the difference between what Cfcca and Parasite does with their archive and what Alta and John are doing with their archives lies on the fact that Cfcca's project, when we started working with our archives, it wasn't related to collecting, but rather to cataloging existing materials that were collected organically through the history of the organization. And I think that it's worth highlighting there the distinction between the institutional archives are collected organically and are documenting a history. So in a way, they are following decisions. They are following an institutional direction, an institutional decisions throughout their history. Whereas I think that with the other two archives, what's happening is that there is a conscious decision of what it will be collected, of the history that those materials will create and will document. That is to say that Cfcca hasn't gone to, we are still in the process of cataloging these materials, and Katie is in a better position to explain this process. And we are keen to develop collections policies, but we are also very conscious that those collections policies should be sensitive of other archives and other collections. So we should be, so I guess what I'm trying to say is that Cfcca's archive is tightly related to the actions of the organization. And once we finish cataloging and organizing those materials with the aspiration to make these materials open to the public, to artists, curators, researchers, to create their own interpretations of those materials, we will then be in a position to decide whether we want to collect materials beyond our institutional practice and curatorial practice. Katie, I'm not sure if you want to add something with regards to the actual catalog.
Yeah, so carrying on from what Marianne has just been talking about, I think very much what my role is it's more a passive role of I'm dealing with the material that's already been created over the time, and it's more what we decide in terms of what, it's not exactly what to collect, it's more what to retain and keep, because there are, due to various UK legislation, there are materials that we cannot keep over a certain length of time. There are some things which are not, you don't keep for research purposes because there's no research need to keep that. And we do at the centre, what we have is a retention schedule that a lot of sort of business archives have, which goes through all the material that an organisation will produce and which material should be retained permanently and which should be disposed of at certain time periods. But I think my overall view of how we document things is basically what I'm trying to do is to try to document all the activities of the centre and make sure we do know we don't miss anything, if that makes sense. So in terms of, we found looking at things at the past that we are very dependent on what our former members of staff have kept or documented. So there are some cases where we only have a little bit of documentation about something. And what has been interesting about this process is that we've identified events and exhibitions and activities that we didn't know about previously that have been lost, not even that, only from like 10 years ago or so, activities that have been not documented clearly, but the information is still there for us to find and make this accessible and available to people, so we can understand a lot more about how the organisation has developed over time. I think yeah, a lot of the things is to do with a lot of my job is, because we have had times where material has been kept where we have material that's been kept by members of staff just as they've been in the course of activities which don't exactly relate to the activities of the centre. So we do have material that people have retained which we can't legally make available, accessible to people as well. So we have material, I think that's one of the things as well, that about, it's not just of what we collect, it's what we can make available to people. So we are very restricted by anything that has personal data in, because we can, under the Data Protection Act in the UK, we can retain that data, we could retain that records for research purposes, but we can't make them accessible yet. So they may be accessible some point in the future, but without that individual's permission, we can't make that information available. Also, one of the issues of collecting things organically is that we have a lot of material which isn't our copyright, which isn't the centre's copyright. And there are many intellectual property holders within our collections, and we just don't have the capacity to contact every single person. And there are also people that we can no longer trace, artists who worked with us in our early days. We cannot find any contact details for them now, and we can make that material available to researchers in-house, but we cannot make that accessible online. And that's one thing we have to judge as well, is what material we can't digitize. We do process our records and make digital copies, but we can't make all of these accessible on our online catalogue due to the legal restrictions. And also we do need to be very respectful of the artists who've worked with us in the past, that they may not want their material made available online. So one of my processes, as well as documenting our collections, is also trying to contact artists that we've worked with in the past to retrospectively get their permission to make things accessible to the public as well. So it's a lot more than just documenting the collections. There's also these other aspects that we have to go through to make our collections accessible to people.
Sure. That reminds me of how, I mean, to what extent that we could, or you could show on materials like unsuccessful proposition from artists, or some of those resident programs. Well, we only selected the successful artists, and that's often the archive, but how about the rest? And that could be something quite controversial, isn't it?
Yeah,
we can't really show
looking at that sort of that in terms of we only have a little bit of documentation about unsuccessful proposals. So a lot of that documentation has been disposed of by the staff members at the time. We don't tend to retain that information because of it's a bit controversial to keep that material about proposals by ones that were accepted. So it's quite a difficult thing to decide to do, because obviously that would be interesting to researchers in the future, but in terms of respecting the rights of the artists who created that, they may not want that work made available, research made available to the public. So yeah, we don't, in the past we haven't retained that sort of material. I think in terms of looking at our residency records at the moment that I'm doing as part of this project, I'm retaining some material about the procedures about how we selected artists, but in a way that we're not identifying artists, which makes it quite difficult to do, because for the terms of the centre, it's interesting for the centre to record what our procedures were in the past, but we also don't want to be disrespectful of other people who applied and were unsuccessful. So it's quite a difficult, it's a little bit of a minefield at the moment to decide. We're deciding whether that material should be kept for the process to document the processes, but also to make sure we don't do anything that's disrespectful to the people who applied for those positions.
Yes, certainly. I wonder whether Warren echoed this point as well, especially when you are looking at, I mean, when Parasite is looking at what to collect and what not, and how could you make that decision and what to choose? Oh, you're mute.
Sorry. Definitely, I agree with Katie. It's very difficult, when you have all this information. Actually, personally, I mean, I still have some informations like, meeting minutes, job applications, artist proposals, and so on. And currently, like Parasite's archives, as only like they gather all these existing public materials in a way, like press release, invitation card, catalogs. And I suppose the work of the current Parasite is simply to create accessibility to these materials. Basically, they digitize all these things. But I guess for research purpose, as I mentioned that, like, preparing the exhibition, you have all this correspondence with the curators and artists, and also many things involved, which could only reveal like many other things, not the exhibitions. But we don't know how this could be useful besides all these confidentialities. So I suppose like it's a very difficult situation. The only thing we could do perhaps at the moment, simply not to dump all these materials, and until a certain point and like everybody died, or like after many years, then that could be, you know, revealed or disclosed. And actually, as I mentioned, that only if we could find time to wait for these informations, and it would be more possible to have like different, you know, interpretations.
Sure. I was just relating to, I mean, the similarity of the Parasite Archive and also Cfcca in the way that I think Mariana mentioned about that institutional decisions, and somehow the archive is not simply about reviewing the work itself of the artist, but also reviewing the history of the institution. So there is something more. There's multiple layers here. It's not simply just about the artwork. There's also the institutional history, which you can somehow unfold your social and cultural history, the landscape in these affiliated countries. So in the case at Parasite, it would be a review of art development in Hong Kong, and whereas in the Cfcca could as well be Chinese-British artists, or Chinese art, contemporary art development in Britain. So there's additional layers of these information going into the archive that makes it quite a unique place to document. I could totally understand that the difficulties is the disclosure and also the privacy regulations that we're bound by. Yes, Alda, please.
Yeah, I think though, when it comes to issues like, do we keep that funding application that was rejected or not? I think in these cases, especially when we talk about certain kind of archives and archives that are, you know, representing certain histories, that funding, that rejected application probably says more about the funding body than the organization itself, you know? Often you have a perfect funding application and a very unresponsive funding body because the public policy at that specific moment in time is of a certain kind. So, you know, I think, and I think also art is not just the product. You know, art is the process. This is, you know, Paul Gilroy actually talks much more eloquently than me about this when he says that we really need to look into what is this, you know, machine that produces art, and the funding and the you know, the liaising with policymakers, with funding bodies. That's all part of the process. And we set up Future Histories because our first funding application was rejected. And it was rejected because it was not coming from us. It was coming from the V&A, from the Theatre Museum. And the officer basically said, well, why should we fund an activity that should be part of the core activities of this institutional archive? This should be part of your core activities. Now, I really, I mean, I am so upset with myself. I never kept that application because actually, you know, keeping that funding application, that rejection, that then, you know, made us wanting to set up an independent organization that would look after this material is a foundational act. And we as artists, we respond with passion against rejections. That's part of what an artist is. We make art out of it. We actually, you know, this ignites our imagination. At times it crushes us as well. Yes, that's true. But I mean, you know, if I look at the history of Black theatre and the uphill struggle for all these, you know, companies to get to the point of finally reaching the National Theatre and, you know, etc., etc., all those rejections are incredible. The other thing is, you look, for example, at all these incredible scripts that were never produced. So you have these writers, these script writers, that send, the script to the National Theatre, and the artistic director. I say the National Theatre simply because, we're talking of institutions. I'm not, pointing fingers to anyone or anything, but let's say, and then the artistic director of the time says, well, no, we don't think this is actually the right script. What do we do with that script? Do we throw it away? Do we keep it? Do we give, visibility to that or not? Or we have unpublished scripts, unproduced actually, more than unpublished, but most of them are also unpublished scripts in the Nitro Theatre collection. There are actually about 50 of them. Now, for a small company, theatre company like Black Theatre Cooperative at the time, how could they produce everything? They also had to make choices. But I'm sure if we go through those scripts, we will find gems. Bernardine Evaristo has very recently decided to do a whole collection of unpublished novels and fiction. So what is funded, what is not funded, what is published, what is not published says a lot about the time. And, to be the pedantic archivist here, keep it, don't throw it away, don't do, my same mistake of not really keeping that first funding application.
Definitely, there would be another project, like an archive of unpublished materials or undisclosed and not able to disclose.
Can I just, sorry, Wesley, can I just add a point there? That we have it, yeah, I know this sounds a bit, but we keep, a part of our collection, we keep unsuccessful applications by the centre to other organisations. So we have quite a lot of that where we've had funded applications which have not been successful, and I think we keep those because that's documenting our activities. Whereas I think in my mind, on the opposite way, it feels a bit, I don't know, it's always that's quite difficult to make a decision about when artists send things to us. But I don't know how to put this without sounding but in terms of responsibility, who is responsible for that to retain that record, whether it's our responsibility to retain that record or the person who created it originally retains their own records as well. And I think that's one of the difficult things, is that whether we have there is a right, do we have any rights to keep this material when we didn't actually create it? It's not related to our organisation, if that makes sense. Mm. So it's more to, I think that's been quite difficult with some of the material we have, that it's interesting, but in terms of, do we really have the right to keep this when it doesn't really belong to the centre in some way, it belongs to another body or another organisation. So that's always quite a difficult thing when deciding what to keep and what retain. So from the centre's point of view, we keep our unsuccessful applications, but not from ones from other people, unless it's always quite complicated. It's all dependent on how far the application went and what stage it went to, because we do have some materials about exhibitions that never happened. Or residencies that never happened, that got to us. It wasn't like unsuccessful proposals, it's just for whatever reason the actual event or exhibition never happened, but we've got all the material leading up to that point, but the actual exhibition may have never happened, and that's we would retain that sort of material.
Yeah, that reminds me of, the architects are very good at like producing blueprints where the building is never built. But you have all the sketches and up to the point of all the detailed constructions that have been produced. And yes, it made a very good record eventually. That's how they all often kept it as well. So I suppose that this is also a tricky point for centres and archives to make that decision. I also wonder how a big archive like AAA does. I suppose that lots of artists may have also approached AAH if they want to give out their lifetime of collection. And are you taking in every single piece of it? How does it work then, John?
Before I start, it looked like Mariana wanted to say something. Mariana,
Mariana want to say something?
No, I mean something. Just to clarify something, when Katie was talking about what to keep and what we have the right to keep and not, and what not, I was thinking more, for example, of unsuccessful applications from artists, in which case you definitely need their own permission to keep those applications, and sometimes it's possible for us to get this permission, and some other times it's not. But on what Alda was talking about, I absolutely agree. I think that, and I hope that we will discuss this further later in our conversation, the way that institutional archives are creating a history of the different policies is brilliant. It's brilliant how you can unpick not only the way that policies evolved, but the way that policies impacted. The impact of these policies on the institution, and perhaps, hopefully, we'll have the chance to discuss this in one of your next questions, Wes.
Yes, we'll come back to your point. Thank you, Mariana. Yes. And yeah, John, you want to give us some insight into how the practice at AAA?
Yeah, sure. So
sorry, can I just remind all the audience to switch off your microphone?
一個先啊，佢而家有啲人話佢啲台灣菠蘿唔係未熟晒。
Somebody's cooking dinner now in Hong Kong time probably. So can we remind all the audience to switch off the microphone?
I went ahead and muted that.
Oh, perfect. Oh, can you do that actually? Oh,
yeah. Apparently we can. So
okay, all right. Yeah, I have to learn that. Okay, that's good. Go on.
Anyway, to answer your questions, I think, and also to follow up on what Alda and Warren and Katie were saying, I mean, I think that one of the things that differentiates an arts organization that primarily exists to archive or to build an archive, an arts organization such as a gallery or museum that is an exhibition space, is that, you know, the archive is there in some ways to document. And that document is not just, what gets documented is not just the history, right? And I think Mariana was referring to this with the kind of evolution of policies in an institutional archive, but also the contexts and the practices, but also the networks and communities that the individuals and the work is embedded in, right? So it is that all of that messy context, because I think one of the things that, you know, a white cube space does brilliantly is it makes it helps the audience focus on the artwork and kind of lets the artwork shine in the way that it needs to, and make the artwork available to the viewer. But what the archive does, but in some ways it does that by suppressing or kind of holding, you know, basically kind of putting aside all of the rest of the things that led to the creation of the artwork that surrounds it, right? And what the archive does is it kind of allows for us to re-embed the artwork within the larger question of context. And so there is a network that archives kind of map onto. Each archive kind of creates a whole network of people, you know, not just the successful artists who showed at Cfcca, for instance, or at Parasite, but also all of the artists who maybe were considered for art, you know, for an exhibition, but never did show there, or who had conversations with the people who ran the organization, or who, you know, who were otherwise involved. And so the principle for building a collection at an archive, and in our case anyway, in some ways follows on that, in the sense that, you know, there are going to be the collections that we started with. In some ways, they kind of help suggest where directions could go, you know, where things could go and how to build and what directions to continue in. And so, you know, there are ways in which, for instance, the fact that some of our earliest collections had to do with artists of China in the 1980s, then, you know, such as, like, for instance, Zhang Peili or Zhen Sentian, right? then leads to an art critic like Li Xianting, who was a very important critic of that moment, who was very familiar and friendly with these artists, and whose own archive, includes them, but then also includes other artists, right? And so there's a way in which these kind of archives, each archive in itself suggests other paths and other histories and contexts and networks. So it's kind of like this growing web that we can expand from. So that's one principle of how we collect and what we collect, who we collect. But I think, there's also, as I mentioned earlier, the principle of what is at risk, what is marginalized, and maybe what deserves to have greater attention and access. So these are kind of the principles that we follow.
Good, thank you. I wonder whether Alda want to respond to that in relation to that sort of spider web of network when you've look at the archive, and also in your case and in most of your case, that aspect of policy review and the sort of kind of structural landscape of art and institutions and practices at the particular period of time, and how does it all unfold together in the archive?
Yeah, I think this is where the archive gets really interesting for me, It's the rhizome. It's the idea of the network, the horizontal network, is this idea of alliances, and how we build those alliances. And those are actually the incredible and unique value of an archive. If I go to an exhibition, I will see already all those who've been selected. How can I access those who have not been selected? And maybe some of those voices resonate with me much more. Which kind of power do I have as a viewer to make those decisions? When I go to see an exhibition, I will have a curator that will have already made the selection. And those selections are made on issues of taste, as well as ideas of nations. What is the nation? How do we build a nation? What is included? What is excluded? So all these dynamics, which are incredibly powerful, can be unlocked through the archive. Hence my suggestion of never throwing away, although I know that, retention policies might want otherwise, but never throw away material that at first sight might not look as holding rich information, but it really depends from which kind of, which point of view we assess, right? The other question is value. Now, the question of value is a really critical one. And going back to, this idea of the role of the archive within the wider cultural, political and social landscape, I think what happens within an archive is the possibility of shifting the lens, of moving the lens, and kind of focusing on something that within that kind of wider, bigger landscape is lost. So it's like zooming with your camera, right? And having the possibility then of going deeper in observing certain dynamics that then can explain to me better what the macrocosm is. And in that sense, if we look at, the multicultural archive, this becomes of paramount importance. So to go back to what is it that we are collecting, right? We're collecting stories and histories that have been excluded. And that process of exclusion, we have to name it if we want to really be honest and open in addressing it and effective in addressing it. And addressing exclusion doesn't mean to, necessarily have acts of violence. It's actually the opposite. It's actually addressing the hidden violence that is behind that exclusion. And therefore, by addressing we can heal. And so the archive is a place for healing, and healing those macro dynamics, which otherwise they're too far for us to reach and to engage with. But we can engage with that story, we can engage with that exclusion, we can by showing it, calling the artist, getting the negotiations going, you know, etc., etc. And that creates, again, with this idea of the rhizome and rhizomatic heritage, which is something I've been recently writing about, kind of explode the concept of the national institution.
I wonder whether, thank you, Ada, that's a very brilliant point about this like archive as a song of healing. I've kind of like to expand this notion, and I wonder Warren would like to say something about that.
Yeah, I just want to say I really agree that, and I think it also points out the possibility to create that, you know, a function for the institutional archive probably would be something like to allow a third party to archive, you know, this institution's information, because, you know, like Cfcca or Parasite, you know, when they have their in-house archive, they definitely have a lot of considerations. You know, they're still looking for funding, they're still having a lot of, you know, trouble, you know, getting things done, and, you know, open up their own information probably would have something contradicting to these directions. And I suppose it's also difficult because, for example, like for Parasite, it's been 45 years and we are still alive. You know, think about that, like for the current Parasite staff, if they would do something which probably they worry if we would be angry, you know, and so on. And that makes it very complicated. And I suppose an institution needs to have really like strong courage, you know, to open it up. But of course, we all know this is really difficult.
Yeah, indeed. And I wonder whether Mariana wants to respond to that as well. I mean, in terms of like institutions and your archive.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in this idea of the possibility that an institutional archive, the possibilities that an institutional archive creates, both internally in the way that it can influence institutional narrative and institutional memory, which has been created from certain individuals, how this can be challenged, how the institutional memory and narrative corresponds to the actual information, but also, as Warren mentioned, open it up to interpretations, because, and at least what we want to do, what we are doing with CFCCA's archive is to catalog, but not create interpretation. The interpretation is a matter of, we are offering this offer of the materials publicly is to artists and curators and researchers to read these materials from different angles and provide different interpretations. I can see this as a few of the possibilities. From a curatorial perspective, it's of course something that I think John mentioned, Warren mentioned earlier, with regards to the temporality, how the archive, the documentation of a curatorial activity overcomes the ephemerality and temporality of curatorial practice, how it creates this historical document that again challenges curatorial practice in many different ways. But yeah, I think it's this possibility for the institution and the possibility for a a transformation within the institution that the archive can bring that is brilliant.
Yeah, and I suppose, well, this is really relates back to these questions about the uses of the archive, isn't it? Certainly, well, that's it opens up a lot of doors and opportunities, and it links on to different kinds of networks and exchanges as well. And I know Alda's been making very good use of the archive in many different ways, and I wonder whether you can share some of those things that you did in related to what you talk about, sort of opening up the network and also archiving exclusion.
Yeah, I guess in a sense, this was from the very beginning the raison d'être for the organization, and it was to provide access and to try finding ways of developing access in a very in creative ways. I mean, as an art archive, we're dealing with art. Art is about, creativity. So the archive needs to reflect that in the way that it engages with the material. So we did it by, as I said before, engaging the artist directly in the process of identifying the material, selecting the material, cataloging the material alongside the archivist for the projects that we fundraised for. We were the first ones to actually publish archives of Black theatre online in the UK on the National Archives website, the A2A website, Access to Archives. So to do that, it was really important for the board of directors and myself to make sure that, the idea of co-creation and the idea of participation would be embedded in the concept itself and the practice of access, right? This was very important. So on the one hand, we're talking of these large projects that kind of engaged, for example, with material from the V&A. As I said before, we brought students from, first year drama studies in universities, to artists, to activists, journalists, historians, to the V&A to look at the material, to, in the process of cataloging, in the process of archiving, not after. In the process of creating those records, because creating records of an art archive is an art process, is an artistic process, is a process that has to be reflective of its own material, because we're talking of something that otherwise will fail to, not necessarily the interpretation, but reaching out to people, in a sense, I think, or at least we thought. So we created focus groups, we created engagement activities. We also, when we finished the very first project, we decided to take some of these unpublished scripts down to the Brixton Art Gallery when it existed, and we had play readings in the gallery. So we decided that, play readings could be something, and again, we took of plays that had never been produced, had never seen the stage, could be a way of engaging people with narratives that they had not been be exposed to because of, the way in which, 20 years ago, stuff would be put on stage or not. And this is where my collaboration with the Embracing the Archive cluster, research cluster at UCL and Gothenburg University has been absolutely fascinating. This idea of developing participatory methodologies and a participatory action research that would bring, researchers, artists, activists, archivists together in working around this complex issue of the archive and then providing access out to this process.
Yeah, and that reminds me of like AAA is doing a lot of activities through your own archive. Is it an active agency of collecting, but at the same time it's also generating lots of art-related events and residencies, and somehow to me is an agency to also is an agency of art production. So you're technically producing art alongside the development of art in Asia. Would you want to say something along this line, John?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that maybe is particular, although maybe less particular now that I'm hearing Alda speak about it, is I think the way that for AA as an organization, the archive is never just a repository or kind of a deposit of information, but also is a place of activation. And so it's a place where artists can also, it's a space where artists can create, and it's a space for researchers to, do research, obviously, but it is also a place where I think, thinking about that knowledge is something that artists can do and kind of create new knowledge and new work. But it's also a space where artists can maybe inform and help the organization and those of us who are part of it think about the activities that we engage in. So how is it that we are kind of thinking about archiving? How are we thinking about history? How are we thinking about communities and networks? And so, and learning and all of these kind of related issues that I think, touch on the knowledge that I think is at the heart of archiving. And so, I think AA had its first artist in residence, I think it was in 2008 or in 2009, and with the artist Pak Shan. And so it was really kind of, starting from there that we, have continuously worked with artists, not just as a kind of, in order to help document their practice, but also for them to help us think about our own process and how to open ourselves up to kind of a larger audience. So that's kind of one of the kind of the principles, not just generosity, but also activation as a kind of a principle for AA.
Yeah, well, I mean, the activation is, I've also observed that it happens at Cfcca as well, having residence now is also based on the sort of new archive. Whether Mariana wants to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, in a very similar thinking, with a very similar thinking, we've experimented back in 2016 when we started working, cataloging and organizing our materials. We've experimented with several engagement with the materials. With some of them, we continue until now. I mean, with regards to what we've decided to continue and what not, is very much to do with our capacity as well, because this is on top of all the other activities that the center has. I mean, more specifically, we've developed an archive, an artist residency that directly engages with the archival materials. And this is open to the artist's interpretation. They can choose whatever materials they want to engage with. And this consequently will inform the work that they will develop during their residency. Back then, we started, it was the point when we started our community engagement projects, and the archive was catalytical in this process. We've collected a series of oral histories that documented the migration experience of the Chinese community, which was tightly related to the development of the organization, at least at its earlier stages. A festival in collaboration with other organizations, again, trying to open up these materials to the public, but also engage our communities. And also a public program of film screenings films that were previously part of our of Cfcca's program, and talks unpicking this idea of the archive, the complexities, but also discussing with other archives, I mean, in a similar way as we do today, the differences. We have to say that at that point, it was we are at these early stages of understanding the possibilities of the archive. So it was a very new thing for me, and trying to understand how the interconnections of those materials with the curatorial. And for Katie, I think, and she can talk herself, it was really interesting because it was the first time that she was working with an institutional archive, coming from a very different experience.
Katie, do you want to tell us?
So previous places I'd worked had been more like the Asia archive, where it was they were an established archive which had collected material and had their own institutional archive, but also collected records. So it was mostly based in universities. So this was the first time in this job that I had to start from nothing at all, which was quite a challenge, I think, of just coming in and going, here you go, to sort out our archive. So so it wasn't quite like that, but it was a bit of a challenge as well. It changed my perceptions as well, because I came from a very distinct perception of working within archive institutions, and the sort of what we would explain what I'd see in archive as, and also working with a very different sort of organisation. And what I think, there was one point where I think it was what I see as being our institutional archive wasn't exactly what the centre saw as being its institutional archive. So there were some materials that hadn't really been transferred to the archives, more what you call more the business records of the organisation. But as transferring those to the archive, we've been able to open up more about the history of the organisation, how it progressed, rather than just more program history. And I think as well, I've changed, my perceptions have changed by working with the resident artists who work in the archive materials, because it's sort of given a very different perception of how they see the archive material. And I found that it's sort of brought new ideas to how we can use our archive by seeing how they use it. I think has been quite interesting, and how every artist we've worked with has used the collections in a very different way to produce an artwork based on what we hold in the archive.
Right.
And I mean, equally for me, it was a huge revelation, because it influenced. I was in my first year of my second year of the PhD, working with Cfcca as a case study for the PhD, and this opening up of those materials was instrumental in the way that I then developed the PhD study. I'm thinking now that I can't imagine how the PhD would be without it, in a way.
Yeah, I like the fact that you all kind of mentioned about these sort of participatory aspects. I mean, the participation between the archives and also the artists, but also there's more beyond the artists as well, because it also branch on to very different kinds of communities and networks. And I mean, for example, Mariana's case, and it's branch onto your own sort of curatorial role and also your study as well. And I'm looking at the time. I know that we're kind of hitting towards the end of the session, but I want to ask one more question around the table before we open up for discussion. It's very much about I know that you all did fantastic work with your archive, and you all run around like a mad person to get materials in and make it really fruitful and accessible to the public. At the end, to whom does it matter? Do you think that your archive does justice to the communities and sort of artists that you represented? Warren?
Well, I have to admit that actually I haven't done anything with Parasite's archive. Basically, I just kept information for this archive.
Sure.
But
sorry, I should actually point it out that, well, I was calling Warren to answer it because certainly you wear a double hat. So certainly you would be answering on behalf of yourself as an artist. So how you see that all these evolutions of the archive, and do you see relevance, and to whom does it matter?
Well, but perhaps I can answer. I can give two answers. First, I do make projects like with archival materials, or personally, I'm still working very slowly archiving an artist very active in Hong Kong in the 1980s, Josh Horn, and he left Hong Kong like around the time of 1997, and he moved to Vancouver. And I curate his exhibitions in Vancouver as kind of like an interim result of archiving his work like 3-4 years ago. And for me, and I would say it's for a very selfish reason, because I just want to see how much I forgot and how difference between my personal memory and the work finally he would explain to me. And that's somehow like for a very personal reason. But the second answer towards Parasite's archive, and I actually would like to reframe it as a question to like both John and Katie and Mariana, because what I find that like when they develop this program of participation to explore their own archives, how actually they would archive these extended activities. Would it be just the same as their like usual archive, or they would just consider it differently?
John, you want to answer this?
Okay, so if I understand, Warren, you're asking when we have people coming in, do we archive or document the activities that happen? Okay, well, that's a tricky or complicated question, I would say. On the one hand, I think we always try to have public facing activities. So if someone's coming in, even if they're kind of there in residence, ultimately we want them to do some kind of program so that people can find out about what they had been doing. So in that sense, there is a kind of something which is outward facing. On the other hand, how the residency, in the case of residencies, itself takes place and what actually happens on a day-to-day basis, that doesn't necessarily get archived in a kind of, or documented in a meticulous way. I would say it kind of depends on who happens to be there, what people are inclined to do. So sometimes there's traces of those participation, and sometimes the traces are maybe more ephemeral. In all cases, the paradox of being in an archive is that the institutional archive is often not necessarily itself available in the same way that the archive is, right? So I think like, it's kind of like CFCCA, like, we have our activities that's outward facing, and then we have the kind of the back of the house business, and that back of the house business often is like, left there, whereas, what happens in the front office is, what everyone sees. And so the institutional archives, it's actually in some ways CFCCA is like more ahead of the game than we are, because we have not made our institutional archives available to people in the way that CFCCA has. I don't know if Alda, your situation is different or not.
It's actually very similar to yours. We also haven't made our own archive available so far. But I think going back to the original question, I think in a sense, I think our activities have succeeded in doing, what we plan to do. We certainly were faithful to those who actually trusted their collections with us, because we did do all the activities in terms of preserving the material, cataloging the material, and making it accessible. The Future Histories archive collections are currently held at Goldsmiths University. And we keep on receiving requests for uses of material for publications as well as research. And we have emails sent by researchers thanking us immensely for, having made sure that this material wouldn't be lost, and that has been made accessible to them. So we have publications that came out also as a result of this material being available. We have students who access it. We produced an online exhibition, to my knowledge is the first online exhibition on the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade in British performing arts, which was launched in 2009 and has since then received an average of 10,000 hits per month, with an average visiting time of 2.5 hours. So that means that people go onto that platform, which at the moment we received some funding recently from the Heritage Lottery Fund to basically rescue this unique resource from the old kind of website to a new HTML platform, because obviously there's digital. There are digital issues there to always be aware of when we deal with digital, dissemination, and so I think in a sense, we have really tried hard to make sure that these resources would be used. I am not particularly happy with what we are doing at the moment, in the sense that I think we could do much, much more in engaging communities that don't really know much about, the material. So far I talked about the usual suspects, the students, the researchers, the artists, and that's all fine and it's fantastic. But I think now we are 20, so we've grown up. We should have enough strength to go out and reach out to those who actually don't even know that this could be of interest to them. So I think this is actually going to be our next challenge.
Right. Yeah. Next project. Definitely. And Mariana, do you want to wind up for Cfcca?
With regards to the activities, or
with regard to whether the archive is, to whom is it relevant, to whom does it matter eventually with this archive?
Yeah, I see. I mean, I was thinking when you ask this question, I was thinking this notion of agency and this idea of who holds the archive, who creates interpretations of the archives. And I think that it's really interesting to say that, and it's a conversation that we've been having with Katie from the very beginning, but also with the organization, of course. I see ourselves as facilitators of this resource rather as keepers. So this resource, we are tidying up, we are organizing those materials with the intention to make them available. This is our role. Our role is not to create I mean, I'm saying that, but at the same time, I did create interpretation as a researcher, but with a different hat on. Archivists, curators, organizations, when they enter this process of making the archives available, then they should do that in a generous way and in an open way. And this is this is what we do with our archives. With regards to whom it's relevant, it's a very good question. I think it's certainly relevant to the artists and curators and cultural practitioners and whoever wants to understand the complexities and the history of multicultural organizations in the UK, and how these kind of documents the history of the multicultural debates. So there is this interconnection between a social discussion and a cultural, an artistic conversation. So yeah, certainly other organizations with similar focus, similar remit, researchers, policymakers.
Right.
Can I add something?
Yes, John, please do.
In the question of relevance and who is it for, I think, excellent points have already been raised about, the archive can serve the people who donated the materials. So obviously the artists and the organizations that AA works with, or, in the case of Cfcca, the people who are represented in the archive. All of that is true. And I think one thing that I would want to say is that the archive itself creates a certain, I talked earlier about the context that each of these archives maybe represents, but I think that, the archive itself also generates a new context. So in the case of Asia Art Archive, I think one thing that is particular about what we do anyway, is that because we don't come from or represent any specific nationality or, that allows us in some ways to work with multiple different regions or parts of Asia, right? And so then that allows for conversations across the region, which don't necessarily happen in and of themselves. That is to say, the art scene in China often kind of is locked in on itself, and then the conversation in Pakistan, for instance, is locked in on itself, and so on and so forth. And what happens at AA, because we're working with different parts of the region, you can bring in together these kinds of realizations of connections that maybe were not so obvious when you're just in one of those areas, right? So to take an example, one of the very first Indian related collection that we had was of Vivan Sundaram and Geeta Kapoor. And, of course, they're very important figures within an Indian context, but then through another archive that we have of a Hong Kong artist, Ha Bik Chun, it turned out that Vivan had participated in an exhibition in Hong Kong. And so there was then all of a sudden this connection between Hong Kong and India, right? Or in the case, to take the question of multiculturalism, one of the archives we have relates to Rashid Arine's exhibition, The Other Story, right? And so that is, of course, related to a context of the UK, but it's also related to questions relating to many other contexts and many other stories. And so what happens through the archive is the juxtaposition of all of this material that creates in and of itself a new context.
Yeah, well, excellent. I think that's a very good point. And obviously, wherever we think about the archive as if it is a dead entity that we just collect things, but actually archives is not simply opening up opportunities, but actually an active agency to pursue art development in many different aspects. And within our panel, you demonstrate the fact that, there are multicultural voices here with all of you, what you're doing. So that's an excellent end of. Thank you, John, for jumping onto that. That's great. I'm looking at the clock, and I know that some of you need to jump off to another appointment. And I think we could almost just accommodate one question before we end the session. And I wonder whether there's any burning questions on the floor that someone wants to ask. We would ask you to raise your hand because the chat box, for some unknown reason, doesn't work. Is there any questions on the floor? Someone want to ask anything? Very quiet. Anybody or a comment that anybody wants to make, that would be happy to hear from you. I hope that it's not only just us talking for the past 2 hours. I hope that some of you are still here. You're tuning in. Anybody? Okay, so I take it as a no. And so I hope that all of you enjoyed this session, and I have to thank so much the panel speakers for these wonderful conversations, and I think it's very rare for people working in the archive to come together to share experiences and to also understand the practice and what it really entails within the archive. So it is a perfect opportunity to get us to understand the inside out of archives, and also the archive that you are involved in is very particular. It's not any other archive, so you're doing all wonderful work. So thank you very much for participating. And also, before I let you and also let the audience go, I do want to say that we have another part of panel discussion within this series. The second part is called Pressing Challenges. It looks at systematic issues within multicultural art organisations and the sectoral challenges of equality, diversity, and inclusivity, particularly in recent years. So this panel discussion is on the 17th of March from 5 to 7 p.m., which is the GMT time. So unfortunately, some of you in Asia might have to miss it, unless you stayed up late. So we very welcome you on board, regardless of it. You'll find the registration link on our Center Creature website. So I really hope to see you all again. And once again, I thank all the participants, panel discussion speakers, as well as the audience joining us today. So I'm sure we'll meet again. So I think, well, I'm just on time, strike the clock of two now. So thank you very much, and see you next time.
Thank you all. This is amazing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. Beautiful.